These men were acting with impunity, and they still are. I met many parents who had become racist or become more racist because they hadn't been listened to by the police. If they're hiding behind the smokescreen of ethnicity or religion, we need to remove that smokescreen.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. There have recently been some surprise entrants into the conversation on grooming gangs in Britain. The historical sexual abuse scandal has found attention across the world all of a sudden and looks set to become a make-or-break issue for English politicians in the next election. I can't help but feel that we've arrived a little late, but someone who has been here since the very beginning, on the front line of the feminist campaign for the rights of women and girls, is author and activist Julie Bindel. She's just finished an exclusive investigation into the grooming gangs that still operate to this very day, speaking to police and victims across the country, and she's here to tell us about it. Julie Bindel, welcome to UnHerd.
Thank you.
For our American audience, there is at least half of the audience watching online who will have only heard about this story through potentially Elon Musk. They won't know very much about British culture and the various kind of histories that build up to this moment when this has become this world story. Can we just go back to the beginning? You were there right at the start of this issue. And can you just explain how it was discovered that these grooming gangs existed in Britain, where they are based, and why exactly those places might have become a hotspot for that sort of sexual abuse?
I first heard about grooming gangs, and we didn't use that terminology then, before I became a journalist. So it was at the end of the 1990s, and I was working as a social researcher, looking at violence against women and girls. And obviously, child sexual abuse and exploitation was part of that. I heard about an organisation that had been set up in Leeds, a city in the north of England, called CROP, the Coalition for the Removal of Pimping. And it was founded by a woman called Irene Iverson, who herself was from Sheffield, which is known for its steel industry, largely an industrial working class city, not that far from Leeds. And Irene's daughter, Fiona, had been targeted when she was aged 14 by some men who were African Caribbean and who had previously been dealing in drugs, and that was how they made their money. But what they did with Fiona came to symbolise what happened to girls in the so-called grooming gangs that we've heard so much about in recent years. They targeted her because she was additionally vulnerable, because all girls are vulnerable, obviously. She'd been bullied at school. Her parents had split up, and she was upset about that. And this was a white family, and Irene, the mum, was a liberal peace activist. Not in the slightest bit racist. But what these men did when they targeted Fiona and started coercing her into having sex, giving her cannabis to smoke, offering other drugs, alcohol, was that they said if her mum tried to dissuade her from seeing them, these men were in their 20s, that's because she's racist. Now, for Fiona, the worst thing in the world would have been to be called racist. And so therefore, they'd second-guessed what Irene, her mum, would say, and they got her. They ensnared her. They captured her, and they started sexually exploiting and abusing her. Irene went to social services, the Child Protection Agency. She also went to the police because the age of consent in the UK is 16. These men were having sex with this girl. It was statutory rape. But she got nowhere because what social services said and what police said was that Fiona was making a lifestyle choice. It was consensual. She wanted to be with these men. And she was staying out overnight. This is not something a 14-year-old girl should be doing. She certainly wasn't safe. The end of this story is a terrible one. Because what these men did, again, the blueprint for what happened at much greater volume in later years, was that they pimped her into prostitution. And when she was 17 years old, she was murdered by a John, a punter, a paying customer. And of course, the men that groomed her were making a profit from her. And at that time, Irene Iverson had set up the organisation because she knew other mothers. She knew women whose daughters had been groomed by mainly men from ethnic minorities Some of them were immigrant men. Some of them were second-generation African Caribbean men. But they presented themselves as exotic, as different to these girls, these white, largely working class girls.
If we chart it through, would you say that the kind of socially isolated, often impoverished, perhaps very naive, shamed young woman, shamed both sexually and then also culturally, would be a kind of hallmark of what we now are still seeing today?
Yes. And thinking about the specifics of Fiona Iverson's case, she was, as you say, vulnerable. She had been told that if her mother tried to get her to stop seeing these men, she would be a racist. The social services and the police turned a blind eye, said that she was consenting. They said she was making a lifestyle choice. The men then pimped her into prostitution, so there was a profit involved because drug running had become too risky, so the girls became the merchandise. And then, of course, Fiona's ending was terrible, but the point is that all the way through this, her mother, Irene, desperately tried to get help and didn't get any from the law enforcement agencies and child protection agencies. But the other women that she knew of who had also contacted the police and social services about their daughters, all around 13, 14 years old. Oh, and something very specific about UK law is if a child is under the age of 13 and a person has sex with that child, even if the child is saying they wanted it, that defence of consent in court can never be accepted. If, however, she's over the age of 13, sometimes these men that abuse these girls will say, well, I thought she was 16. She told me she was 16. If they're below the age of 13, that isn't possible. So the girls are always around this age. And these mothers that spoke to Irene often had car registration numbers and they had phone numbers because they'd confiscated their daughter's phone, or they'd taken the number down when they called the landline, because this was in the early days pretty much pre-mobile phones. They had descriptions of the men. And in certain towns surrounding Leeds, so in Yorkshire, which is a big region, there were towns which were former mill towns. So they were post-industrial, and most of these mills had closed down. Mainly, those that worked at the mills were newly arrived migrants from Southeast Asia, from increasingly the Middle East. Many of them were Pakistani Muslim women and men. And of course, within that, there was a criminal element. So Irene kept hearing about these Pakistani Muslim men who were driving flash cars, who were targeting their daughters. They were working in the marketplace, maybe, where their daughters were visiting. They were being given drugs and alcohol and coming home stoned and intoxicated. But the police did nothing. And that's why Irene set up this organisation. And this was 10 years before I first wrote about it. And in fact, it was before any other journalist wrote about this in the national media.
Mm-hmm. Why is it that a mother like that wouldn't come to the police and say, my daughter is being abused by these men, and it be immediately picked up and jumped upon by the local police? What went wrong there?
Child sexual abuse has long been a neglected area of criminal law and police attention. The majority of child abusers are never apprehended. The majority are never reported. But even those that are, we have a shocking record of allowing men, because it largely is men, of getting away with child sexual abuse. But there was something very specific about the demographics involved here, which was white girls largely, although there were some Asian girls also, white girls and largely Asian men. And this was because the assumption of sexual health services, social services and the police was that these girls were in fact pretty worthless for choosing to go outside of their own neighbourhood, in other words, white boys, and have sex with, hang out with these men, these Pakistani Muslim men, for example, who were definitely seen as not worthy of white girls. But the racism was vicariously planted on the girls. So the shame became the shame of the girls. The men, it was business as usual. And so part of the reason why police and social services did nothing is they thought the girls deserved nothing from them. And quite frankly, they were consenting to it. The girls called these men their boyfriends. The men knew that this was a really good move. If these men had said, I'm going to be your pimp, I'm going to sell you to all of my business associates, the girls would have a different language to work with. But these girls fell in love with the handsome younger gang members, and then they were passed around to the elders within the gang, who then, of course, did pass them around, did prostitute them. And, of course, the pimps would hang out outside children's homes and pick them up and give them the love that they so desperately craved. So at first, that was how they targeted the girls. And it's a very clever way of ensuring that by the time they'd finished with them, they couldn't go anywhere else. They'd isolated them from their parents. They'd told them their parents didn't understand them. Again, they were racist. That the police were going to get the girls into trouble, lock the girls up if she reported it. That social services would take her away from him, the man she loved, and put her in some kind of locked children's home. And they believed them because they were children.
Fiona's story obviously has a particularly horrendous and newsworthy conclusion, but for most of the girls involved in this story, it didn't end that way. How many girls do you think over the last 30, 40 years have suffered the abuse that you described that Fiona did up until her death?
Oh, hundreds of thousands. When we see the findings of inquiries, including the local ones in some of those northern towns in England, and the national inquiry that was published in 2022, where they talk about more than 1,000 girls, for example. This is not even the tip of the iceberg. These men were acting with impunity, and they still are, largely. And the impression that we get is that now that there's a spotlight on them, these men are being reported, arrested, charged, and convicted. That's true for the tiniest minority of cases. So we are talking about hundreds of thousands of girls, and not just in the northern towns of England, in Wales, in Scotland, in the north of Ireland, across the UK, in cities, in villages, and in towns.
We'll talk about the current situation, I think, in a moment, but let's just pause for a moment on that kind of fear of the charge of racism, which seems like it's so baked into this question. I'm actually surprised by that. It's something that I would expect had come later, perhaps in more recent years where people became more politically correct. There's a kind of leftist movement to reduce racism overall, Black Lives Matter, whatever else. I thought that perhaps that element of it might be more recent, but you're saying actually, in fact, it was a tactic used by the perpetrators actually from day one. Can you just speak more about that and how that's shifted over the last few decades?
It was a tactic because it's never been an attractive prospect for people who aren't very outwardly racist to be called racist. Back in the 1990s, certainly before September the 11th, which came at the beginning of the 2000s, there was still racial unrest. There were still those people in very deprived northern towns where the industry had shut down, who felt that they were now unemployed because there was an influx from outside of the UK willing to take their jobs as cheap labour. So there was always the danger of racial unrest and tension. And by the time we're talking about these tactics and these gangs, attention had shifted significantly from African Caribbean communities through to South Asian communities.
And is that just because different waves of immigration produce these different groups?
It is, but also we're talking about young men travelling without their families and left to pretty much do what they want, like it's the Wild West. Somewhat unemployed, somewhat unemployable if they didn't have English as a first language or if they didn't have any particular skills they brought with them. And so these particular men gravitated towards gang crime, largely drugs. But the police got wise to that, which is why they shifted their attention. to girls because they are a very lucrative way of making money.
What do you say to the people who, in the present day, call this a dog whistle or a kind of social stereotyping?
Well, of course it's not. It's like saying that by pointing out that some men sexually abuse children, it's a dog whistle against all men and that you're pointing the finger at the entire male race. We are not. In 2002, when Anne Cryer, who was the MP for Keighley, another northern town where gang-related abuse of girls was endemic, when she spoke out about it, she also spoke out, and she's a white British-born woman, she spoke out about other terrible practices that had become normalised in the UK under Islamic law, which of course doesn't exist except for in the Sharia courts. And one of those was forced marriage, the marriage of children and adult women to cousins, for example. And she spoke out about female genital mutilation, which was prevalent, again, in some communities, such as Somali and Egyptian communities. And she was instantly called racist. This was a woman who had been, let's say, the right side of history on social justice issues throughout the time that she'd been an elected politician. When I wrote my first piece about this in 2007, when it was published in the Sunday Times magazine, I was instantly, the next day, put on Islamophobia Watch, which was a website, thankfully now defunct, set up by hard leftists, white hard leftists, who decided any critique of political Islam, of practices under Sharia law, were instantly Islamophobic, often accusing women who had come from Muslim backgrounds themselves when they spoke out against Sharia law. And so this was something that was highly politicised. I don't recognise the term Islamophobia at all. If they mean racism, they mean towards those Muslims that are brown-skinned, and therefore it's not against their religion. Religion is an entirely different issue, and yet it's used by abusers and by those that want to defend those abusers as a shield, as a human shield. What I did find when I was doing my investigations in the early days was when I spoke to people, whether it was an imam or people who ran Muslim community groups or Asian women who had spoken out against the wearing of the full face veil, they instantly, warmly welcomed my scrutiny on this issue. They wanted this to get an airing because they knew that if the white liberal intelligentsia put some kind of lockdown on the topic, then it would become fodder for far-right racist groups. And guess what happened? It did. So when I spoke or tried to speak to white liberal social workers and even some feminist groups about this topic, they shut down. They blanked me. They were too scared to speak out condemning these gangs that were made up of largely Pakistani Muslim men. Nobody, including me, was saying they did this because somehow it's stamped through their DNA to abuse children. There were all kinds of reasons why these men were overrepresented as perpetrators. But we didn't get a chance to outline this. And so when the far right, it was the British National Party at the time, decided this was their topic, they took it and they ran with it. And they did create a narrative that was a deeply racist, inaccurate narrative. And it was as though, if you listen to the British National Party, girls and women everywhere were completely safe from any abuse of men unless they were Pakistani Muslim. So it didn't help anyone.
I suppose it must be interesting for you as a feminist campaigner to find yourself in the middle of this kind of maelstrom of people who previously have not had much worry or care about the rights of women and girls, but now have seen it as this issue to grasp and to use as a political football. You might think of Tommy Robinson in this country, or the Reform Party, the right-wing party in this country, which might be the only touchstones that anyone from an international view has of this issue. Those are the people who they will hear speaking about it from this country. How does that feel? I mean, you are someone of the kind of old left, I suppose, in a certain way. What's it like to be in the middle of this and surrounded by so many right-wingers?
Well, it's massively frustrating in the way that the left has betrayed women. And this is something that we need to firmly establish way before I can talk critically about those on the right. And I remain on the left, and I refuse to capitulate to the ridiculous ideology that's become prevalent, whether it's about pro-surrogacy, pro-sex work, sex work is work, or just the craziness around the Middle East issue, the Palestinian cause. I refuse to capitulate to those shibboleths. I mean, it's outrageous, the misogyny on the left. But how it feels to me is that they have allowed the right to take the ground on this. Now, if Elon Musk were to offer £5 million, which is only about $7.5 million US, to fund the support services for the girls that are trying to get away from these grooming gangs and get proper support so they can raise their children properly and so that they can live their lives without ongoing trauma, that would be so welcome. So it's not that I, as a left-wing feminist, have any objections to Elon Musk raising this as an issue, as a topic. What I won't have is history being rewritten as though Tommy Robinson and other right-wing goons put this agenda on the map. No, that's not true. Feminists, women like Irene Iverson, and of course we have less political clout, and of course we have a smaller platform than the likes of Elon Musk or Tommy Robinson. We were the ones to raise concerns about this issue. The mothers of the girls, then as the girls became women, the survivors of these gangs, they put this on the map. They wrote books, they spoke to the media. I wrote pieces when I was still being told by my editor at The Guardian that we couldn't publish anything in The Guardian at that time because we'd be seen as racist. So the left allowed this to happen, and the right, understandably, have gained a reputation that it is the only platform where we can suitably discuss these issues.
Keir Starmer, leader of the British Labour Party, in fact, Prime Minister of this country, has come under a lot of scrutiny because he was Crown prosecution, he was the lead prosecutor during this time. I suppose the next question has to be, what does this mean for him? Because obviously it's going to become a real headache for him. It already has. Musk tweeting about it alone caused a huge kind of wave of anger towards him from Americans and from British people, and a renewed sense that he was in some way involved in the blocking of this kind of move towards justice. What does it mean for Keir Starmer? Is it going to be the end of the kind of British left, if you could call Keir Starmer left?
Well, it would be good if we could raise the British left to the ground and build it back up again, because it is, quite frankly, not fit for purpose right now. Keir Starmer, when he was Director of Public Prosecution, so the chief prosecutor in the land, I think he did more than any other DPP to tackle child sexual abuse and violence against women. In fact, I know he did, because when he was a barrister and going on to chief prosecutor role, I worked with him. He was instructed as a barrister, as a senior lawyer, on some of the cases I campaigned for. He sat on a panel alongside me when I published a piece of research on female genital mutilation, where I was railing at the fact that although this had been a criminal offence in the UK since the 1980s, there had not at that time been one prosecution. Keir Starmer was desperate to push that through. He also looked at the low conviction rate for child sexual abuse. The problem is he's a terrible politician and he's a dismal leader. So he will not succeed on changing the mood music around this. He's completely ineffectual in the role that he's in.
Can you tell me about the recent developments that have been in these cases? There have been a number of kind of moments of inquest, a number of moments of kind of public outrage. Can you just chart those for us?
When I first wrote about this in the Sunday Times magazine, it was seen as a niche aspect of child sexual abuse. It was not really seen as a pattern across the nation, although we knew, again, from the mothers and from some of the brilliant although they were few and far between, but really important whistleblowers within child protection and within sexual health. And within the police, there's Maggie Oliver, who walked out of the police, realising that the girls had been failed yet again. Over the decades, there have been valiant attempts by campaigners to show that this problem has not gone away. This is not a case of historic child abuse. This is current. It's happening here and now. So we had various inquiries into pockets of the UK where it was obvious that this was very prevalent. And we had the Rochdale inquiry, and that was over a decade ago. We had survivors from Rochdale, again, another northern, very working class town, where the girls demanded an apology for the way that they had been failed by Greater Manchester Police that resides over Rochdale and surrounds. And that was huge because that was a public apology, recognising these victims had been badly served. There's been a very important TV drama that was shown a few years ago and has since been repeated on the BBC called Three Girls, that again shows some of the victims and the struggle they had, where they were criminalised rather than the men that were abusing them being criminalised. Again, calls for public inquiries resulted in the ICSA report, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, which was not worth the paper it was printed on. It barely looked at the grooming gang phenomenon. There were 5 pages devoted to it.
Why? How does that happen?
Because they wanted to look at all aspects of child sexual abuse that weren't contentious.
Right.
I mean, all child sexual abuse should be contentious.
Is this the same report that said that, in fact, group-based child sexual exploitation offenders were most commonly white?
Of course they're most commonly white. We live in a nation that is, I think it's 73, 74% white. Of course they're mainly white. But looking at the way that the gangs operate and the specifics of these gangs, as I say, targeting by using younger men, passing the girls up to the men that work mainly within the nighttime economy, so they're opportunistic, as well as forward planning, prostituting the girls, making money from them, keeping them away from their friendship groups, their family structures, targeting care homes and the like. So, of course, the majority of abusers are white, but the majority of those running these particular gangs are Middle Eastern, Southeast Asian, South Asian, Muslim. The majority are Muslim. And they're given a get-out-of-jail-free card because, of course, particularly since September the 11th, the Terrorism Act and racial unrest and tension, the police don't want to have to bother to deal with it. It's not that the police care about being called racist. The police can't be bothered to mop up the mess of fighting and unrest on the streets.
So we come to today. There is a call for a national inquiry. Keir Starmer has said that he's spoken to the victims, and in fact, they don't want a new national inquiry. What do you think about that?
Well, I interviewed many of the victims for the investigation, and they all are saying something has to be done. What they want an investigation into is why the criminal justice system has failed, why it is that the girls are blamed for the abuse themselves, and to look at the demographics, the specifics of the perpetrators and of the victims. Because unless you do that, then you don't know where these men are coming from, who's protecting them, who's shielding them, why the police aren't acting, why the girls are too scared to report them, why the parents might be hesitant to ask for help. And in fact, somebody said to me recently, who was arguing that the real problem we've got with child sexual abuse is interfamilial, in the home. Of course, these are largely white men. Well, I've concerned myself with child sexual abuse of all kinds, all throughout my adult life. But we understand it. We don't do enough to address it, but we understand the dynamics of interfamilial abuse. And we need to get better at helping the victims report it and then targeting the perpetrators.
That would seem also uniquely hard to defend against.
Of course, and it's really, really hard. All issues of child sexual abuse, it's extremely difficult to try to get victims confident enough to report to police, and that's the job of the police and the other law enforcers, to help the girls feel more secure to do that, such as a publicly funded awareness-raising campaign, which could be easily done if they spent a bit of money. But this particular person who was lecturing me about how child sexual abuse is mainly within the home, perpetrated by white men, she said, and I don't know why they're talking about Muslims all the time. None of these men would be in religious households. I mean, it just wouldn't happen in religious households. They'll be in other communities that don't adhere to religious doctrine. And I looked at her and said, what? Of course they're in religious households. Did you suggest that Catholic priests who were sexually abusing children, that they didn't really believe in God, or that they weren't within a religious setting? Did you say that about nuns who were being violent and abusive to girls whose babies they were removing? Did you say that to the Orthodox Jewish people in North East London in the 1980s, where there was a terrible expose of child sexual abuse because rabbinical law was seen as more important than the law of the land? Of course they're religious. They're shrouded by their religious identity. Just because a man believes in whichever God they believe in, that doesn't make him a good person or someone that isn't going to sexually abuse children. And this was simply to give Islamists, who are screaming about this from the rooftops, as well as the white liberals, a get-out-of-jail-free card.
In all three of those examples, couldn't it be said to be true that also the religion, to some degree, enables?
Of course.
Or it allows you to morally bend your mind into a place where something like the sexual abuse of children becomes ethically sound.
Yes, absolutely right. I heard harrowing testimony from a woman who, when she was 7 or 8, was taken by a much older male relative to be abused at the mosque where he taught. I've spoken to imams, some of whom are appalled at the white liberal capitulation to this nonsense. But there are also many imams who just write it off as Islamophobia. And one even suggested to me that because the Prophet Muhammad has been accused of being a child abuser, that all of a sudden all Muslims are similarly accused. It's crazy.
To strongman the oppositional argument here, I suppose, is there not a fair argument to say that this fundamental disagreement with the worldview of many followers of Islam, which can be in some way justified by their readings of the Islamic texts, would, when taken into its logical conclusion, end with Islamophobia? That there would genuinely be a hatred, if you took these ideas to their extremes, of that first principle, the first principle of following Islam.
Yes, and I've spoken to Muslim women who are survivors of childhood sexual abuse who now advocate for other victims within their groupings, who have told me about Muslim men being targeted within the town where she lives, and one was killed, one was murdered. The rumours were around the neighbourhood that he, of course, was a child abuser, and this had only come from earlier rumours that he was part of this grooming gang because of his ethnicity and religion. So there's that. There's the smokescreen of religion, which helps many abusers, and they know it, and they know that they're less likely to be targeted by police because of this, because, as I say, they don't want the hassle. And then there are the accusations towards the victims that they are racist for reporting this. But when I was in Blackpool, which is a very impoverished town in northwest England, investigating the disappearance of a girl that I mention in the piece called Charlene Downs, and this was back in 2004, I met many parents who had become racist or become more racist because they hadn't been listened to by the police. Perfectly ordinary, decent white people who had lived side by side in harmony with their neighbours who were Pakistani Muslim suddenly were telling me, don't call a taxi, they're all Pakis, which is a terrible racist term, obviously, for South Asian people in general. And they had honestly become racist because they had no outlet, and they were told that they were racist for reporting it. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mm.
And I was told many years ago, when I started looking at the abuse of women through prostitution in the sex trade, started looking at pimping gangs then, that it was racist to use the term pimp because it was racialised. The word had become racialised because so many men had been, at certain times in British history, who were pimping, were from African Caribbean backgrounds, heritage. Well, that was a simple fact in the way that the Maltese pretty much ran 1960s criminal London, and the way that white men through the 70s and 80s were dealing heroin. Often crime is racialised, but to be told, and this was by a child protection agency, that we can't use the term pimping, we have to start using sexually exploited, meaning to be raped by men for money, because it could have a knock-on effect towards certain groups of men. That to me was deeply racist. What they were saying was, because it's African Caribbean men pimping, you can't use the term pimping. Yes, let's use a euphemism like sexual exploitation.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. They're further racialising an issue that is about men sexually abusing and raping and pimping girls. And with these gangs, the demographic is largely, predominantly Muslim, brown Muslim.
So integration is going to be the next question. If these grooming gangs are targeted, if another national inquiry happens, whatever happens next, there is going to be this big question about whether integration is successful at all or even possible. So that's the next thing we need to think about, is in the major metropolitan centres of Britain, you'll find extremely successful stories of integration. But you go out into places like Rochdale, Rotherham, Blackpool, what you see is a very different story. Do you think integration can work in those places?
It could, if we stopped being such pathetic cultural relativists, accusing people of being racist because they say women arriving from Pakistan or Thailand or wherever should be encouraged to, required to learn English. Many men that are abusing women that come to this country, and women often follow, can't speak a word of English, can't report the abuse if he's abusing her to the police, can't read a leaflet saying where she can go for help. He speaks English, she doesn't. But when women that work on issues to do with domestic violence or rape say this, they are called racist. We should expect somehow women should be left not speaking a word of the language in the nation where she has come to settle. That is ridiculous. Anyone that suggests that that's racism is completely mad. And of course, it's part of the very baseline of integration that we need to encourage, that we need to enable. I mentioned earlier the child abuse scandal in the late 1980s in one of the Jewish Orthodox communities in the UK. Many of the children within those families, they would go to religious school, they couldn't speak English. Some of the women couldn't speak English. The law of their community was rabbinical, and the police considered those communities as a no-go area. And this is what's happened with some of the religious Muslim communities in the enclaves you mentioned, Blackpool, Rochdale, Rotherham. That's still happening. There are many, many Sharia courts, despite the fact that Sharia law is not in any way recognised as law. And people are adhering to that, and police officers are accepting this as though this is perfectly reasonable for women to live under that tyranny.
Let's talk about the present day, because a lot of this conversation might feel, and many conversations like it, as if we're speaking about a kind of historical case. Something that happened a long time ago and we have a lot of distance from, and we're just saying how terrible it was that it happened, but we need to get, justice for the victims by having a public apology, something of that like. Not the case, it seems, from your recent investigation. Sadly, this does seem to still be going on, but has metastasized into a new form of this gang grooming.
The only thing that's changed is much of it is now conducted online in the first instance. So Snapchat and TikTok, any of those platforms where messages disappear. And many of the girls are being targeted and groomed through those vehicles. Whereas when I first looked at it, you would walk through the shopping mall, for example, in Blackpool, and you could see the young men making the initial contact with the girls.
It was in plain sight.
It was in plain sight, and you couldn't avoid it. You would see it in parks and in takeaways. Always in takeaways, taxi ranks and the like. And now, as I say, it's gone online, but it's still exactly the same as it was, because they're tried and tested methods. They're very simple, straightforward methods that the abusers use to ensnare the girls, to break them down so that they feel that they desperately need their abuser. They don't have their parents anymore. They've run away from the children's home. They've become addicted to alcohol and drugs. There is a lot more drug use now, heavy drug use, in the initial stages. There's still a hands-off approach by the police if they consider that the girls are consenting to relationships, as they would call it, with their boyfriends, as they refer to them. And there's still complacency with social services, many of whom, although I did speak to one really excellent group of social workers that are doing great things, joined with police to investigate where the girls are being picked up from. Largely, social workers who are under-resourced are just not bothering about this type of street-based grooming gang abuse. They are called to hellish scenes in the family home, often with seriously injured, sexually abused girls, and they're removing them and they're putting them in care homes. Now, guess what happens? They're targeted yet again by men that know that they are additionally vulnerable.
Seems absolutely extraordinary, not to be too naive, that this conversation could be happening for many decades. It could now take a world stage, be recognised by potentially the most powerful man in the world, Elon Musk. It becomes a global talking point, and yet still, if you are a young girl in Rochdale and you go to your local police station and you say, I'm being abused, or you are found as a child who's been in care to be being abused by one of these men, that the high likelihood is that that abuse will continue and very little will be done to stop it. How have we got to this place? How is it possible that there can be so much public awareness, or so it seems, and yet this is still able to go on at such great levels?
Because the majority of the girls are working class or subclass. They're seen as worthless. They're seen as dispensable, as bringing on the abuse themselves. And we barely have any decent child protection in the UK. It's in an appalling state. So it is the blaming the victims, seeing the girls as sexually active through consent rather through abuse and coercion. And that's why, because the girls have such little status in the world. And that's the one thing that we don't talk about enough, is the class prejudice and how these girls are entrapped by that. And as I say, by the vicarious allegations of racism, because they are seen to be having sex with, when in fact they're being raped, by Asian men.
It would also seem like a natural issue for the left then. If it is a class issue, as you say, then it would seem like something that, as a leftist, you would want to jump on.
Yeah, as long as you're men. The thing is, the left has betrayed women. It largely supports now the party line amongst leftist dude bros, brocalists, is that sex work is work, that somehow this is not a problem. Very, very disenfranchised, impoverished women and girls being bought and sold as sexual objects by wealthier men with higher status. They support this. They support the surrogacy trade, which is women's wombs being trafficked, used by wealthier people. They support all manner of things that are bad for women. They support gender identity that's put women and girls in such danger, particularly impoverished working class women and girls. The left has betrayed women.
Are there still perpetrators from the original bout of these abuse allegations who are free and living amongst new generations of young women?
And their original victims, which didn't ever get to court. For example, women I know now in their 30s are telling me that the men that were raping them as children, who might have ended up in prison for some other crimes, maybe even the same or similar crimes against other victims, are still wandering around the town. One woman told me that she had a takeaway delivered by the man that used to rape her when she was 13, 14, 15 years old. So yes, they're still around.
Again, it's economic as well, isn't it? If you can't move out of the town that is home to both you and your rapist, then you're stuck.
That's right. And this is exactly why I said, partly tongue-in-cheek, but partly seriously, that these very wealthy men that have put this item, this atrocity, back on the agenda, should really put their hands in their pockets and give some money, because those that are supporting and defending these girls are doing it through their own charities that they've set up. They're working for nothing to try to support and defend these girls. It would appear that nothing is being done at governmental level. And whether or not a deep dive public inquiry into the grooming gang phenomenon specifically, as opposed to all forms of child sexual abuse, whether or not that would do anything, because it would take years, the ICSA report took 7 years, it cost millions of pounds, is another matter. But if the government really wanted to tackle this, then they could do some serious, honest talking about why they think these girls have been failed and why there are so many perpetrators, the vast majority of them, still walking around, still acting with impunity.
When you speak to victims, present victims, and those in the police who are aware of what's going on, what is the mood like in places like Rochdale and Rotherham, Blackpool? Has it changed? Do they feel more aggrieved now that so much time has gone past? Are they relieved to see it becoming a public conversation? How do they feel about the moment we're in?
The victims I've spoken to are very angry that this is still happening to new generations of girls, that the vast majority of victims have never had any justice, that the men are still acting with impunity. Police officers are telling me that they're under-resourced, they can't do anything, but they can certainly do things about drug crime. They can certainly respond to other crimes committed where lives aren't ruined. What we need is a proper, deep dive scrutiny into who these men are, how they are able to get away with it, and who the girls are and how they're targeting them. Because at the moment, we collect no demographic information at all. We don't know the men's, whether they're working, whether they're unemployed. We don't know their ethnicity. We don't know their heritage. We don't know anything about them, except if they ever get arrested and charged, their names. And why don't we? Because if, as those cultural relativists are constantly telling us, that this is nothing to do with an overrepresentation of men from certain ethnicities, that is not true. The Home Office has commissioned pieces of research that try to twist all of the figures to tell us we are not looking at disproportionate numbers of men from particular ethnicities. Well, if that's true, why are you so concerned with collecting that information? What's the problem with that? Because surely it would reassure those white liberals that it's got nothing to do with particular groups of men being overrepresented. It's all just something made up by the nasty racists. But feminists on the left and the mothers of these girls, none of whom are racist, have been pointing out the demographics of these particular groups and saying, none of us believe these men are doing this because they're brown or because they're Muslim, but they're doing it because this is how they've organised their particular criminal gangs, and they're getting away with it because of fear of being called racist or because of complacency around criminalising a particular group of men that might be able to shout Islamophobia. Just deal with it.
There have been arguments made that for the sake of society's cohesion and the nice quiet that we all enjoy on a daily basis, that we should kind of keep these statistics locked away, because to bring them out would be too damaging to the social fabric. What say you to that?
The girls need protecting. That's the bottom line. The girls deserve protection. And we shouldn't vilify a person because of their ethnicity. That goes without saying. They should be vilified for their actions, for their abuse. And if they're hiding behind the smokescreen of ethnicity or religion, we need to remove that smokescreen. Community cohesion can't possibly have a chance of operating, of being present, if there are abusers acting in plain sight and getting away with it.
Are there green shoots, to ask you one final question, that this is being taken more seriously by people who weren't taking it seriously before?
I think because of many of the survivors who are now campaigners, some of the early whistleblowers, those that are not scared of telling the truth, those that are not frightened of the ridiculous, baseless allegations of racism, are pushing this forward so that it can't hide anymore. Our politicians, as disgraceful as they have been on this issue, can no longer pretend it's not an issue because so much of the nation is fired up about it.
Julie Bindel, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
So that was author and activist Julie Bindel telling us the history and present reality of the grooming gangs here in Britain, a stark reminder that these things are not all left in history. Read her piece on UnHerd and find out more. Thanks for watching.